Bloody Mary. That's what they called her over the overhead page when the trauma alert sounded. Not Elena Martinez. Not even by her first name. Just Bloody Mary, the running joke among the resident physicians who'd heard she'd donated blood for 3 straight trauma cases in a single shift back in March. The nickname stuck like antiseptic on scrubs. Dr. Ashford had been the one to start it, dropping it casually during morning rounds like it was her actual designation, and by week 2 it had metastasized through Seattle General's ER like an infection nobody bothered to treat. Elena didn't flinch when she heard it. She never did. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical drone overhead as she moved through the hospital corridors at 20:47 hours, her blue scrubs moving with a kind of fluid efficiency that came from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Her hands never trembled. Her pace never quickened. She simply existed in the space between one task and the next with the calm of someone who had already survived the worst that survival demanded. 16 years of rebuilding a life after the medical discharge looked exactly like this, efficient, invisible, forgettable. Just another night nurse restocking the trauma bay at Seattle General in Houston, moving past the residents and attending physicians who barely registered her presence. The scar on her left forearm caught the harsh fluorescent light as she reached for the trauma supplies. A lattice pattern, really, a roadmap of shrapnel burns from an IED that had detonated outside forward operating base Shank in Helmand Province. The wound had been the kind that should have meant a discharge, a quiet exit, a medical bore that would have ended her career in an Army combat support hospital. But Elena Martinez had learned early that scars tell stories only if someone bothers to read them. Most people didn't look that closely. They saw the scar and looked away. Dr. Ashford had glanced at it once, 2 weeks ago, and quickly returned his attention to his phone. The mark was just another part of the invisible landscape of the night shift staff. Her locker sat in the basement level, among 14 others crammed into a space that smelled like industrial detergent and the ghost of 1,000 forgotten lunch containers. Elena opened hers at the start of each shift and closed it the same way at shift's end. Inside, tucked beneath her stethoscope and a spare pair of compression socks, sat a single dog tag on a broken chain. The name read Webb, Marcus J. The serial number was 847-29-4421. She never explained why she kept it. Nobody asked. The chain itself was damaged, one link torn clean through as if it had been wrenched with significant force, and the tag hung at an angle that suggested it had been recovered from something catastrophic. She touched it once, just once, at the beginning of each shift. A ritual so small that even the other night nurses hadn't noticed. Her hand would rest against the cool metal for exactly 3 seconds before she closed the locker door and moved into the hospital proper. The ER was moderately busy at 2,100 hours, 2 chest pains waiting for troponin results, a diabetic with a blood sugar of 347, and a construction worker with a laceration that would need 15 stitches minimum. Nothing that pushed the department to crisis. The night shift had that particular rhythm to it, the way the pace settled into a kind of sustained tension rather than acute emergency. Elena moved through it with the precision of someone counting steps in a pattern she'd memorized down to the inch. Restock the 14-gauge needles. Check the crash cart medications. Verify the ventilator settings. Move to the next task. The next. The next. Each small action a brick in the wall of professional competence that she'd built brick by brick over the last 16 years, ever since she'd hung up the uniform and learned how to be invisible. The trauma alert sounded at 2,113 hours. 3 short bursts of the overhead speaker, the kind that cut through the ambient hospital noise like a knife through silk. The voice that followed was clipped, efficient, the way trauma alerts always were: incoming motor vehicle accident, driver versus fixed object at high speed, estimated 22 minutes out, expecting multiple trauma cases. Elena was already moving. That was the thing that separated the competent from the merely adequate, the immediate response, the way her body had moved on its own before her conscious mind had even finished processing the message. She was at the trauma bay door before the announcement even finished. She was pulling on fresh gloves before the first resident had left the break room. She was arranging the supplies with the kind of practiced economy that came from having done it in field hospitals where efficiency meant survival. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay doorway at 2115 hours, straightening his white coat with the kind of casual gesture that spoke to the assumption of command. He was in his early 60s, with the weather tan of someone who spent his weekends on a golf course and the bearing of a man who had never seriously questioned his own competence. He glanced around the bay, nodded once, and was about to turn back toward the ER floor when Elena reached for another stack of trauma dressings. The motion was small. Incidental. The kind of thing that shouldn't have registered. But it did. Her left forearm came into the light, the scar visible, the distinctive lattice pattern of shrapnel burns unmistakable in the harsh white glow. Dr. Ashford's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition followed immediately by something else. Calculation. His gaze lingered on the scar for 1 second. 2. Then he looked away, but not before Elena caught the subtle tightening around his mouth. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply turned back to her task, her movements unchanged, her breathing steady. The ability to maintain composure was a skill she'd learned in a trauma tent in Sangin, where panic traveled faster than blood loss and a steady hand was the difference between stabilizing a patient and losing them to shock. She'd brought that skill into civilian medicine without ever explaining where it came from. The other nurses sometimes commented on her calmness during crises. "You're so cool under pressure, Elena," and she'd smile and change the subject. They didn't need to know that cool under pressure was code for "I have held a 17-year-old Marine's abdomen together with my hands while waiting for the trauma surgeon." Cool under pressure was code for things that didn't have civilian equivalents. The trauma alert updated at 2124 hours, single patient, Navy SEAL training accident with catastrophic blood loss, ETA 9 minutes. A training accident. The words meant almost nothing on the surface, the kind of clinical descriptor that stripped away the reality underneath. Elena's body registered the information and filed it away. Training accident. Navy SEAL. Blood loss. Just another trauma, just another incoming patient, just another 4-hour shift pushing toward dawn. But something shifted in her chest, a recognition she didn't allow herself to process fully. She continued her preparations. She pulled out the massive transfusion protocol setup, the kind used when a patient came in exsanguinating. She positioned herself at the 4-access station. She checked the massive transfuser settings. 12 seconds later, the boom of the ambulance bay doors opening echoed through the ER like the sound of impact itself. Shouting. Equipment rolling. The particular chaos of emergency medicine compressed into controlled urgency as the trauma team moved in coordinated precision. The gurney appeared, and Elena saw him before anyone else saw her seeing him. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Webb, or what remained of him. The man was pale as paper, his uniform soaked through with blood, his left leg positioned at an angle that suggested compound fracture at minimum. His eyes were barely open. His breathing was shallow, the kind of breathing that came when the body was already shutting down systems to preserve the critical ones. She knew that breathing. She'd heard it before in the bodies of soldiers whose time was measured in minutes rather than hours. And she knew him. Not from the chaos of his current condition, but from family dinners 2 years ago when her son Jamie had first made SEAL Team 3. Jamie had talked about his commanding officer, the man who'd pushed the hardest, demanded the most, and somehow made his team want to exceed standards they hadn't known existed. Marcus Webb. The man in the photographs Jamie kept on his apartment wall. The man her son trusted with his life in ways that made Elena's chest tighten. She moved to his side as the trauma team positioned him on the hospital bed. Dr. Ashford was already there, speaking in rapid clinical language, type and cross, massive transfusion protocol, get me 2 units O negative stat. Elena was reaching for the 18-gauge angiocath needle before anyone asked her to. Her hands found the median antecubital vein on his first arm. The needle slid in with the kind of smooth precision that came from thousands of successful attempts. Blood flashed into the chamber. She was securing the line with tape while the resident was still fumbling with the second attempt. "I need his blood type." It wasn't a question. It was the voice of someone who had been trained to give orders in situations where orders meant the difference between life and death, but she'd kept that voice buried so deep in 16 years of civilian nursing that when it emerged, it came out measured, controlled, merely professional. Dr. Ashford glanced at her, a flicker of something, irritation maybe, or recognition quickly suppressed, and nodded to the resident. "Check the chart." The resident was pale, knew enough that this level of hemorrhage still triggered the kind of fear response that made hands shake. He fumbled with the paperwork while Elena positioned the massive transfuser at Webb's for line and started the flow. The blood moved in rapid pulses. O-negative, universal donor blood that any hospital in America kept in limited quantities. The kind of emergency blood that ran out fast if multiple traumas came through within minutes of each other. Dr. Ashford was speaking again, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ER. "We need his real blood type the second we have it. Cross-match for 4 units O-negative and then whatever type he is." "Who's his surgeon?" "Cardiothoracic is on standby," Elena said. The words came out level, competent, exactly as they should. She adjusted the flow. She watched the monitor. She waited. And then the room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The kind of quiet that happened when information moved through a space and people understood what it meant. The resident's hand shook slightly as he read from the chart. "Type AB negative." The silence lasted longer. AB negative. The rarest blood type, the one that only 1% of the population carried. The one that couldn't be substituted, couldn't be improvised, couldn't be replaced with anything else. The kind of blood type that meant a patient in critical condition with massive hemorrhage had a mathematical problem. There was less than a pint of AB negative blood at Seattle General at any given time. Webb had lost more than that already. Elena had moved before thought completed itself. "I'm AB negative," she said. The words came out in the same measured tone she used for every other clinical statement. "Draw 2 units from me. Now." Dr. Ashford's head snapped toward her. "Absolutely not. We have a protocol for. The protocol requires available blood." Elena was already moving toward the donation station, already removing her left sleeve. "I have it. You need it. Start the draw." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a suggestion, though she'd phrased it with the kind of professional deference that kept her invisible in hospitals where physicians made decisions and nurses executed them. But there was something in her voice that made the phlebotomist start moving toward the equipment without waiting for Dr. Ashford's approval. Something in her bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed by people with actual authority to command. The needle went in clean. The blood flowed red into the collection bag, the color somehow brighter under the fluorescent lights than anything else in the room. Elena watched the bags fill while keeping one eye on Webb's monitor. His blood pressure was climbing as the transfusions replaced what he'd lost. His oxygen saturation was stabilizing. The critical window was closing. Not closed yet, but closing. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the energy changed from catastrophic emergency to something that might, possibly, become survivable. The second bag filled. She was already pulling the needle out before the technician could ask her to. "Get these into him," she said to Dr. Ashford. Not a request. A statement of fact about what needed to happen next. And that's when the overhead speaker crackled to life. Not with another trauma alert. Something worse. Someone higher in the hospital hierarchy, using the general announcement system, the one that broadcast across the entire floor, "Can we get Bloody Mary to room 4? The words hung in the air like something physical. Elena didn't flinch. Didn't miss a beat. She was already moving toward the door, already putting her sleeve back down, already returning to the invisible version of herself that navigated these halls. But she felt the moment when Dr. Ashford looked at her. Felt the moment when his expression shifted from irritation to something more complex. Something darker. Something that suggested he was assembling pieces of information and beginning to see a pattern he didn't like. Behind her, Marcus Webb's monitor showed sinus rhythm. Blood pressure rising. The numbers on the screen telling the story of a man who would live because of O-negative blood and the hands that knew exactly where to find a vein. The supply closet smelled like bleach and industrial soap. Elena was restocking gauze when Ashford's shadow fell across the doorway, blocking the fluorescent light from the corridor. His voice came low and controlled, the way predators speak when they're certain of their prey. Inappropriate boundary violations with patience, Nurse Martinez. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air pressure changed. You donated blood to someone you clearly have prior connection to. Personal involvement that compromises clinical judgment. Elena met his eyes without flinching. Her hands continued working, gauze into the metal bin, each movement deliberate and unhurried. 10 years of combat trauma had taught her that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The ability to stand 3 inches from a threat and not move. My blood saved his life, doctor. Her voice was flat. Clinical. That's what nurses do. Ashford's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears or defensiveness. Instead, he was staring at someone whose composure made the air feel dangerous. He leaned against the shelving unit, his expensive watch catching the light, a tell that he needed to reassert control. You're too connected to this patient. Too comfortable stepping outside protocol. His voice dropped lower. Do you understand how easily a nursing license can vanish? One phone call to the state board. Allegations of boundary violations. Medication discrepancies in your charting. All it takes is documentation. Elena turned to face him fully. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. The small scar on her left temple, barely visible unless you knew to look, caught the fluorescent light. I didn't violate anything, doctor. 6 words. Quiet. Absolute. I donated blood. That's standard procedure for rare types. That's not what your supervisor saw. Ashford's voice carried a new edge now, frustration leaking through. He wasn't used to people who didn't break. Your relationship with that patient goes beyond professional. I have witnesses. I have the page transcript with your nickname broadcast across this entire hospital. Bloody Mary. That's what they call you, isn't it? Elena didn't respond. She turned back to the gauze, methodical and complete. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Ashford remained there for 7 seconds, she counted them automatically, the way soldiers count ammunition, then pushed back toward the door. You're being reassigned, effective immediately. Pediatrics. General floor rotation. You won't be assigned to any trauma cases. You won't be assigned to the ICU. He paused at the threshold. Especially not to Lieutenant Webb's room. He left. Elena stood alone among the supplies, her hands folded in front of her, breathing in the industrial soap and something else, ozone, maybe, from the fluorescent ballasts humming overhead. She'd been reassigned before. She'd been isolated before. She'd been in worse supply closets with worse men giving worse orders. The real nightmare would come later. The parking lot was a river of rain and fluorescent light spilling from the ER doors. The shift change crowd was gathering, nurses heading out, day shift arriving, the collective exhale of the night crew. Elena walked toward her truck, her scrub soaked through, when Ashford intercepted her with her supervisor trailing 2 steps behind like a satellite orbiting a star. Everyone's listening now, Ashford said. Not quietly. Not privately. His voice was meant to carry across the asphalt, meant to land on every ear within 30 feet. Effective immediately, Nurse Martinez is being moved to general floor rotation due to performance concerns. She will no longer be assigned to trauma cases or critical care. This is a formal reassignment. The crowd had stopped moving. Voices died. Elena stood in the rain, her jaw clenched so tightly it could have cracked teeth. But her eyes remained level with his. Not fearful. Not angry. Something worse, something that made Ashford's hand drift toward his phone as if he needed to document this moment of defiance. A single tear escaped. Elena saw it happen the way soldiers see themselves in mirrors, as outside observers of their own bodies. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, slow and deliberate, without breaking eye contact. My performance saved that man's life, and we both know it. Her voice cut through the rain like a scalpel through flesh. 10 words. Each one measured and final. I've held men's organs in my hands. I've walked through IED detonations and kept walking. I donated blood that's rarer than a full set of organs, and you're going to demote me for following protocol. Ashford's face had gone the color of old concrete. He'd wanted to see her crumble. Instead, he was watching a woman whose composure had the quality of someone who'd already survived worse than unemployment, worse than shame, worse than a rainy parking lot in Houston. That will be all, Nurse Martinez, he said, but there was no control left in his voice. Just the thin edge of panic. She walked to her truck without responding. The crowd dispersed. Ashford stood alone in the rain, his expensive suit soaking through, and pulled out his phone. By morning, the reassignment was official. Pediatrics. Elena received the notice in her locker, a printout in Ashford's handwriting, stamped with dates and times that didn't exist and signatures from people who hadn't approved anything. She stared at the paper for 40 seconds, then folded it with the same precision she'd once used for flag ceremonies. But that wasn't the worst part. That came when she checked the hospital system's personnel portal and found her file flagged with medication discrepancies that she'd never made. Charting errors from 4 months ago that magically appeared in retrospective audits. Small things. Amounts that would amount to nothing individually but collectively painted a picture of incompetence or negligence. 3 entries. All falsified. All dated in ways that suggested pattern and intent. Ashford had gotten to work immediately. The reassignment wasn't enough. He needed insurance. He needed documentation that would stand up if she tried to fight back. He needed her file poisoned so thoroughly that even asking questions would look like paranoia. Elena stood in the women's locker room at 0643, reading through entries she'd never written, and understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about Lieutenant Webb anymore. This was about survival. His survival. Because if she stayed close to Webb, if she had access to his medical care, she would eventually figure out why Ashford was so panicked about her presence. She would see something in his history that he couldn't afford her seeing. She changed into fresh scrubs marked for pediatrics, a different color, a different floor, a different world from where she'd spent the last 6 years rebuilding a life that was starting to feel increasingly temporary. The pediatrics floor was all pastel walls and cartoon stickers and the thin sound of children crying for parents who weren't there. Elena moved through it like a ghost, charting vitals and changing dressings and helping kids with stomach pain understand that their bodies were working exactly as designed. The work was fine. The work was always fine. What broke her was the deliberate routing, the fact that every computer terminal was positioned to prevent her from accessing the main ICU patient boards, and her break room access was restricted to the pediatrics wing on the 3rd floor. By her 4th shift in her new assignment, she'd confirmed the pattern. Ashford had touched 17 different systems. He'd flagged her file with a supervisor note about behavioral concerns. He'd added her to a restricted access list for trauma cases. He'd even left a message in the general chat about nurse boundary issues that would be visible to any attending reviewing her performance metrics. It was competent. Professional. Institutional enough that she couldn't challenge it without looking like she was violating protocol, but thorough enough to ensure complete isolation. Elena folded her scrubs at the end of shift, the pediatric blue instead of the trauma white, and pressed each seam with the precision she once used for flag ceremonies. The fabric smelled of hospital-grade detergent and something else. Something like endings. The elevator down to the parking lot felt longer than it should. The fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that almost looked like Morse code. By the time she reached her truck, Elena had made a decision that would shape everything that came next. She would finish her shifts. She would stop asking about Webb. She would let Ashford believe he'd won, and she would wait. But that wasn't the decision that mattered. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. That moment was still coming. It was arriving at dawn, and it would arrive with the sound of helicopter rotors shaking the windows of Seattle General, and it would carry with it the kind of truth that couldn't be buried in flagged files or whispered in parking lots or documented in false charting entries. For now, Elena drove through the Houston rain, her hand steady on the wheel, and waited. The pediatrics ward on the third floor of Seattle General felt like a different hospital entirely. Pastel walls. Cartoon characters dancing across ceiling tiles. Machines that beeped in minor keys instead of the urgent major chords of trauma. Elena had been reassigned here 36 hours ago, and the reassignment tasted like institutional poison. She moved through the rotation with mechanical precision, checking vitals on a 7-year-old with a broken femur, adjusting an 4-drip for a 5-year-old recovering from appendicitis, charting with the kind of meticulous documentation that left no room for Ashford's fabrications. Every entry was time-stamped. Every procedure witnessed. Every medication accounted for in triplicate. She knew what he was doing. She knew he was building a case. She also knew that fighting back required the kind of visibility she couldn't afford. During her break at 2,100 hours, Elena walked to the third-floor nursing station and pulled up the patient board on the computer terminal. It took 3 seconds to navigate to the ICU for floors above her. Lieutenant Webb's name appeared in bold red letters, critical. Vital stable. Sedated. The notation read major abdominal trauma, acute blood loss, post-transfusion. Her blood. Still circulating somewhere in his vessels, still keeping him alive, still tethered to her in ways that Ashford had recognized immediately. She didn't linger. 2 minutes on the board was the maximum before questions would be asked. She logged out, grabbed lukewarm coffee from the break room, the kind that tasted like burnt copper and regret, and returned to her assignment. A 10-year-old with pneumonia needed breathing treatments. A teenager with a compound fracture needed pain management. Elena provided both with the same composure she'd learned in Sangin, where the worst part wasn't the injuries, it was the silence afterward. The rest of her shift crawled. Elena checked the patient board 3 more times, each break spaced exactly 90 minutes apart, each check taking exactly 2 minutes. Webb's status hadn't changed. Sedated. Monitored. Stable. She allowed herself one thought during the final check, a thought that lasted exactly 3 seconds, before she pushed it away and returned to the children's ward. At 02 for 7 hours, the trauma pager activated. Not her pager. Elena wasn't assigned to emergency response anymore. But the sound traveled through the hospital's intercom system like a predator's call, and every nurse heard it, code blue, ICU, room for 12. Repeat, code blue, ICU, room for 12. Cardiothoracic standby. Elena's hands went still on the medication cart. Room for 12 was Webb's room. The ICU charge nurse, Whitney, came running past the pediatric station with the movement of someone operating on pure adrenaline. Webb's crashing, she called out without stopping. P. No cardiologist in-house. Ashford's trying to get St. Luke's on the line for an emergency transfer, but the weather's turning. Elena didn't move. She stood at the medication cart with a 2 mg midazolam vial in one hand and a consciousness that suddenly felt like it was splitting into 2 versions of herself. The nurse version, reassigned and neutered. The major version, who'd performed field thoracotomies on soldiers bleeding out in the Sangin Valley while mortar fire painted the sky black. The PA system crackled again, urgent and specific, cardiothoracic to ICU. Stat! No cardiologist was coming. Elena set down the vial. She moved without decision, the way muscle memory moves when conscious thought becomes a liability. The stairwell was faster than the elevator. For floors up, her boots making no sound on the tile. Her ID badge still worked, that was one institutional detail Ashford hadn't altered. The ICU doors opened to controlled chaos. Webb lay on the bed with his chest already exposed, monitors screaming their arrhythmia alarm in fractional heartbeats. The resident, Dr. Chen, was performing CPR with the frantic compress-release rhythm of someone who'd never lost a patient before and couldn't afford to start now. 2 nursing students stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching, useless. A respiratory therapist was bagging Webb's face, trying to push oxygen into lungs that weren't cooperating. Nobody had noticed Elena yet. How long has he been down? Elena's voice came out at a different pitch than the pediatrics ward had known. Flatter. Harder. Authoritative in a way that made Whitney's head snap toward the door. Elena? You're not. How long? 2 minutes. Maybe 3. His O2 sat dropped from 94 to 67 in 60 seconds, and Elena was already moving. She grabbed the emergency surgical kit from the crash cart, the chrome tray making a sound like ice breaking as she set it on the bedside table. Her hands found the scalpel without looking. The blade caught the fluorescent light like a prayer. "We need a thoracotomy," Elena said to Chen. "Left anterolateral approach. Do you know where the 5th intercostal space is?" Chen stared at her. "That's not indicated, we should wait for." His O2 is 52. His heart rate is 38 and dropping. He's in obstructive shock from a massive PE, and his lungs have collapsed. Elena was already prepping the site with antiseptic, the chemical smell sharp enough to cut through the recycled air. In 90 seconds, there's no patient left to transfer. In 90 seconds, his brain starts dying. We have 30 seconds. The scalpel was in her hand. 8 centimeters. Clean. Precise. The skin parted like it recognized the authority of the cut. Blood welled immediately, dark red against pale skin, and Elena was moving into the sternum, through ribs that resisted and then gave way to the weight of her knowledge. The thoracotomy spreader went in next, expanding the cavity, and there was Webb's heart, pale and fibrillating uselessly. Elena didn't hesitate. She reached in, cradling his heart in her palm the way she'd done with soldiers whose names were now legally classified. Her fingers began the manual massage, squeeze, release, the rhythm steady as a metronome. Oxygen. Perfusion. Blood moving through dead muscle, coaxing it back to reason. "Get me 1 milligram epi, for push," Elena said. "Suction here. I need to see the left pulmonary artery." Nobody moved. She said it again, louder, now. Whitney moved first, the hierarchy of trauma reasserting itself. The resident moved. The nursing students moved. Elena's hands continued their work, and she could feel it, the flicker, the hesitation, the muscle remembering how to fire. The monitor still screamed, but its tone was changing. Less frantic. More like something was responding. O2 climbing, the respiratory therapist said. 58, 62. 71. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. "There's massive clotting in the pulmonary arteries," Elena said, seeing what her fingers were telling her. "He's got an IVC thrombosis. The whole vascular tree is compromised." She worked methodically, her voice steady as a surgical laser, delivering instructions that the residents followed without question because in trauma, authority isn't granted by title, it's claimed by knowing what happens next. Epinephrine. Saline flush. Manual defibrillation at the 200 joule threshold. The heart resisted once, twice, and then sinus rhythm. The monitor showed a single, perfect beat. Then another. Then a sustained pattern that made Whitney's breath catch. Heart rate coming up. 48, 56. 72. The respiratory therapist's voice had lost its edge of panic. O2 sat 89 and stable. Elena didn't stop. She spent the next 4 minutes finding the source of the clotting, mechanical thrombectomy with her fingers and a careful injection of heparin into the pulmonary circulation, restoring what should never have been interrupted. By the time she began closing the chest with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't her first emergency thoracotomy, she could hear the monitors harmonizing, respiration, oxygen saturation, cardiac rhythm all singing the same song of survival. She was suturing the ribs, 4th stitch, 5th stitch, precision that spoke of years of practice, when she heard the footsteps stop at the room's threshold. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, his tablet forgotten in his hand, his face registering something that looked like recognition. Not of Elena Martinez, the reassigned pediatrics nurse. Recognition of something he'd hoped would never walk back through those ICU doors. His eyes traveled from her hands, steady, expert, beautiful in their competence, to Webb's chest, to the monitors displaying vitals that should have flatlined for minutes ago, to the surgical skill on display in a thoracotomy that no civilian nurse should possess. "What have you done?" Ashford's voice came out fractured. Elena finished the final suture without looking up. "My job, doctor. I'll page cardiothoracic for the next shift. He'll need imaging for the thrombosis, and his blood work needs to be rechecked for coagulation factors." She stripped off her gloves, discarding them into the medical waste container with the precision of someone who'd never second-guessed a movement in her life. "The catheterization lab should be notified. This patient needs aggressive anticoagulation and monitoring." She turned to face Ashford directly, and the voice that emerged from her mouth was a different woman entirely. "He's stable. For now." By 0600 hours, Elena had received the official summons to HR. Security didn't escort her. She walked downstairs on her own, her shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone walking to their own reckoning. The board representative sat behind a mahogany table with the gravity of executioners, and the words they delivered came in the corporate language of termination. "Unauthorized invasive procedures. Violation of reassignment protocols. Questions about your medical credentials and scope of practice." The older representative, whose nameplate read Harrison, slid a thick folder across the table. "Dr. Ashford has documented his concerns extensively. We believe it's in everyone's best interest, particularly yours, to discuss resignation rather than formal termination." Elena looked at the folder but didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. Fabricated medication discrepancies. Falsified incident reports. Years of work being methodically dismantled in careful bureaucratic language. The threat beneath the words was crystalline: resign quietly, or fight a war where the other side controls the documentation. "I saved his life," Elena said. Her voice was flat. No inflection. No defense. Webb's heart rate was 38 and dropping. His oxygen saturation was 52. "I performed an emergency thoracotomy, and he's still breathing." "Which is precisely the problem, Miss Martinez," Harrison said quietly. "You are not qualified to make those decisions. You are not credentialed for surgical intervention. And the fact that you felt empowered to ignore 3 levels of protocol suggests some confusion about your role here." The folder sat on the table between them, thick and damning. "You have 24 hours to decide," Harrison continued. "We can handle this quietly, or we can make it very public. But you will not be nursing here again. That decision has already been made." Elena stood. The chair didn't scrape against the floor. She'd learned long ago how to move without making noise, how to leave a room without leaving an impression. She walked down 3 flights of stairs to the basement laundry, where the night shift was folding hospital linens in industrial washers that hummed like distant helicopters. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, still the same locker she'd occupied for 3 years of Reinvention. The blue fabric came off like shedding old skin. She folded it with the precision she'd once used for flag ceremonies, creasing each seam clean and exact. The hospital-grade detergent smell clung to her hands, her clothes, her hair, the kind of institutional scent that would take weeks to disappear. She left her badge on the shelf inside the locker. The basement laundry room at Seattle General hummed with the white noise of industrial washers cycling through their endless rotations. Elena sat on a metal folding chair at 0312 hours, unable to sleep, unable to process what her hands had done and what her career had cost to prove it. The basement smelled of hospital-grade detergent so strong it coated the back of her throat, a chemical wall between her and the smell of blood she couldn't quite wash away. She pulled her scrubs from her locker, 3 pairs, neatly stacked, and began folding them on the table in front of her. The fabric was still warm from the dryer. She creased the first pair along the shoulders, a precise line like the fold of a flag at Arlington. 1 crease. Then the waist. Another crease. The sleeves folded inward with the kind of military geometry she'd learned 17 years ago, back when uniforms meant something different, back when people knew exactly what she was. Each seam received the same attention. The precision of ritual. The meditative horror of someone performing the last rites for their own life. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that colorless glow that made time feel suspended. No windows down here. No clocks. Just the sound of dryers humming their mechanical rhythm and the distant thud of the hospital settling into its overnight stillness. She had been awake for 37 hours. After the thoracotomy, after his heart started beating again, after she closed his chest with sutures tied in patterns her hands remembered before her mind did, she had sat in the break room for 14 minutes and drank coffee that tasted like iron. Then Dr. Ashford had found her. Within an hour of Webb regaining a sinus rhythm, Ashford had called the hospital board. His voice on the phone had been calm, professional, the voice of a man protecting institutional protocol. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Gross violation of the scope of practice for a registered nurse. Patient endangerment, regardless of outcome. His words had moved through the administrative channels like a blade through soft tissue, efficient and clean. By 0400 hours, the board had convened a special session. By 0500 hours, security had escorted her upstairs. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen who had hired Elena 6 months ago with genuine warmth, could not make eye contact as she slid the resignation letter across the desk. "We're requesting your immediate resignation to avoid formal termination proceedings." Patricia's voice had the quality of someone reading from a script written by someone else, someone with more power and less conscience. "This way, there's no record of disciplinary action. You can seek employment elsewhere without this incident following you." Elena had signed the letter without reading it. Her hand was steady. She had signed casualty reports with steadier hands, had initialed consent forms for surgeries in combat hospitals with the same mechanical precision. "Sign here. Initial here. Acknowledge that you're accepting erasure. Your medical license is intact," Patricia had continued, the words falling like coins into a well. "The APN credential remains valid. Just not here." Elena had stood, buttoned her jacket, and walked out of the building through the staff entrance. In the parking garage, she had allowed herself 1 minute of trembling. 60 seconds of her body betraying everything her mind demanded. Hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking in the darkness of level 3. 1 minute. Then the minute passed. She had started the engine and driven home, where she sat on the edge of her bed for 3 hours without moving until the sun began to lighten the eastern sky. Now she was back in the basement, unable to do anything except fold scrubs with the precision of someone saying goodbye to a ghost. The thing about military training was that it made loss look like control. It made grief look like ceremony. It made the end of everything look like the beginning of discipline. She finished the third pair of scrubs and placed them on top of the stack. Perfect corners. Perfect edges. The fabric smelled like every hospital in every city, neutral and institutional and utterly without mercy. She pulled her locker door open and looked at the badge lying on the shelf, the one with her picture from her first day, her face still believing in second chances, still wearing the expression of someone who thought escape was possible. She didn't touch it. What she didn't know, what no one in the basement knew, what the hospital's entire administrative apparatus didn't yet understand, was that at 02 for 7 hours, Marcus Webb had regained consciousness in the ICU. The pain medication had worn off enough for his eyes to focus. His lungs had expanded on their own, the ventilator backing off as his body remembered how to breathe. And his son Jamie, who had been asleep in the chair beside his bed for exactly 4 hours and 32 minutes, had jolted awake at the sound of his father's voice trying to form words. "Sangin." Webb's voice had been the whisper of someone speaking from the other side of a wall. There was someone. "Archangel, pulled me out." Jamie had leaned forward, his hand already reaching for the call button, then stopping. "Dad. Dad, look at me." Webb's eyes had tracked to his son's face. The focus was still wrong, still heavy with medication and trauma, but the recognition was there. "That nurse who gave you blood. Who saved you during the code." Jamie's voice had carried the precision of a SEAL who had been trained to deliver critical information under extreme stress. "Her name is Martinez." Was she there? In Sangin? Webb's pupils had dilated. His hand had gripped Jamie's wrist with the strength of someone for whom consciousness was returning in dangerous clarity. "Get her file. Now. And call command. Tell them Archangel is here." At 0630 hours, Elena had signed the resignation papers in the HR office. Patricia Chen had slid a manila envelope across the desk containing her final paycheck, calculated to the hour. Elena had signed once more, in a different place, confirming she understood the terms of her departure, understood that she was accepting immediate severance, understood that she was leaving without the promise of a reference. Ashford had watched from his office on the 3rd floor. He had positioned himself by the window specifically to watch her leave through the staff entrance. He had seen her move across the parking garage with that particular gait, the slight drag on the left leg that he had recognized from Landstuhl all those years ago, that distinctive scar pattern visible on her forearm when the light caught it right. He had known, in that moment of watching her escape his reach, that he had made a critical mistake. He should have pushed harder. He should have moved faster. But she had left the building. She was gone. The resignation was signed. His involvement was contained. Except, and this was the detail that would define the next 12 hours, at 0645 hours, Jamie Webb had made a single phone call to the command element of SEAL Team 3. He had not gone through channels. He had not waited for clearance. He had used the emergency contact number given to him when his father had received his commission, and he had said very clearly, "Dad just woke up. He says the emergency room nurse who saved him during the code is Major Elena Reyes, call sign Archangel, from the Sangin operation. She's here in Houston. Seattle General Hospital. And someone is trying to fire her." The person who received that call had been a lieutenant commander named Sarah Holloway, who had served in the same unit as Elena 17 years ago, who had seen her carry Marcus Webb's unconscious body across 200 meters of open ground while rounds impacted the earth around her feet, who had watched Archangel work for 12 hours straight while bleeding from a shrapnel wound that would eventually cost her the use of one leg but not the use of her mind, not the use of her hands, not the use of her absolute refusal to let anyone die. Holloway had made 3 phone calls. At 0712 hours, the sound of rotor wash shook Seattle General's windows. The noise rose through the building like a thunderstorm arriving all at once. 2 UH-60M Black Hawks, the kind that carried combat personnel, the kind that made civilian hospitals look like training facilities, descended toward the rooftop. The landing skids touched down with a force that made the building's structure groan. Down in the basement, Elena heard the sound from 3 stories below and did not look up. The sound of military helicopters was not uncommon in Houston. The sound of helicopters was just part of the rhythm of a city that housed sprawling military bases and trauma centers that served active duty personnel. She folded the 4th pair of scrubs with the same precision as the first 3. But above her, a full-bird colonel, rank insignia visible on combat fatigues, rank insignia that meant authority that superseded hospitals and administrators and individual men with power complexes, was walking through the ICU doors with the bearing of someone accustomed to having doors open before he reached them. His boots echoed on the tile. His presence made the air pressure change, made nurses straighten, made the entire floor suddenly aware that the hierarchy had shifted. He approached the nurses' station where Elena's file was kept. "I need the immediate location of Major Elena Reyes. Call sign Archangel." The floor supervisor's voice came out 3 notes higher than normal. We don't have anyone by that name." In the ICU room 17 doors down, Marcus Webb's hand gripped his son's wrist hard enough to cut off circulation. "That nurse is Major Reyes, Jamie. She's the one who carried me and 6 others out of Sangin. Under fire. For 12 hours. Jamie released his father's hand and stepped into the hallway. He found the colonel exactly where he expected to find him, at the center of the floor, at the center of attention, at the center of everything that mattered. He saluted. Sharp and clean. "Sir." "Lieutenant Jamie Webb, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon." The colonel returned the salute. "Your father? Conscious? Stable? Asking for Major Reyes?" The colonel's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. He turned to the floor supervisor, who was now trembling visibly. "Pull her file. All of it." She resigned an hour ago." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the colonel's radio crackled. A voice came through, "Rooftop secure. Team 1 is staged. Awaiting orders." The colonel pressed the transmit button. "Initiate search protocol 7. Subject is Major Elena Reyes, aka Elena Martinez. Last known location, Seattle General Hospital, Houston, Texas. Status, critical information asset. Find her." Down in the basement, Elena heard nothing. She folded the 5th pair of scrubs. The fabric smelled of nothing but hospital detergent and the death of every chance she had taken since she had escaped Sangin. But in Ashford's office on the 3rd floor, the phone rang. It was his contact at the news station, the one he had called at 0700 hours to plant the story about the rogue nurse who had endangered a patient, the one who was going to help him control the narrative. "Dr. Ashford, we have a developing situation. 2 military helicopters just landed on your hospital roof. We're getting calls from military sources saying there's a Major Elena Reyes at your facility. Can you confirm?" Ashford's hand tightened on the phone. He stood and looked down at the parking garage below, looking for the car that was no longer there, looking for the woman who had slipped through his fingers exactly when he had thought she was contained. She had saved a man's life. And that man's life, it turned out, belonged to someone with resources and reach that extended far beyond a single hospital administrator's ability to contain. But Ashford didn't know that yet. Not quite yet. He was still, for these last few minutes, operating under the assumption that he had won. In the basement, Elena folded the final pair of scrubs and aligned the stack with the precision of someone preparing for an inspection she would never have to endure. She closed her locker. She turned off the light. She walked toward the stairs that would take her up and out of the hospital forever. She did not know that above her, the building was being methodically searched. She did not know that her file, both versions of it, the civilian one and the military one, was being read by people whose authority made institutional hierarchies look like suggestions. She did not know that her name, real name, was being called out across military channels that had been searching for her story for 17 years. She only knew that the basement smelled like the death of hope, and that her hands had folded scrubs with the precision of flag ceremonies, and that somewhere in that hospital, a man was alive because she had remembered how to be dangerous. She climbed the stairs toward the exit. She had made it 3 steps when her phone rang. The rotor wash hit the hospital windows at 0712 hours like a physical force, shaking the entire 7th floor. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended onto Seattle General's rooftop, their rotors churning the Houston morning into chaos. The sound was unmistakable, that thunderous percussion that made people instinctively look up, the kind of noise that meant something official had arrived and nobody had been expecting it. Elena was 3 steps up the stairwell when the building shuddered. She stopped. Waited. That wasn't a medevac bird. Those birds didn't land simultaneously. Those birds moved with the precision of people who didn't ask permission, they issued commands. She continued climbing. The ICU had descended into organized panic by the time the full-bird colonel walked through the doors. His uniform was pressed with military geometry, his presence like a pressure system moving into a room. Behind him came 2 aides carrying sealed files, and the energy shifted. Everyone understood they were no longer running a hospital. They were hosting an inspection. The colonel's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need the immediate location of Major Elena Reyes. Call sign Archangel. I don't care what name she's using. Find her. Now." The floor supervisor's hands trembled as she reached for the personnel files. The colonel's eyes were the color of storm clouds, the kind of gray-blue that had seen classified things and dismissed civilian complications. In room 714, Lieutenant Marcus Webb's eyes opened. His hand found his son's immediately, gripping it with the ferocity of someone pulling himself back to consciousness. Jamie leaned close. "Dad. That nurse. The one who, his voice caught. That nurse is Major Reyes. She's the one who carried you out of Sangin. Marcus didn't speak. His eyes closed again, but his grip on his son's hand became steel. The floor supervisor's hands moved through the digital files with the trembling precision of someone who knew they were opening classified documents. Elena's military file unfurled across the screen in layers. 2 silver stars. A purple heart. Medical discharge, honorable, with a redacted reason. Combat medic training, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Deployment rotations dating back 18 years. She's in the basement, the supervisor whispered. Finishing her shift. But she wasn't. Elena had made it to the parking garage, her personal effects in a plastic bag that seemed absurdly small for a life, 2 pairs of socks, a photograph of Jamie from 5 years ago, the dog tag she'd carried for 6 years that she never intended to touch again. The rain from the previous night still slicked the asphalt, and she could smell it, that particular scent of wet concrete and ozone that reminded her of standing in FOB Shank before dawn. The elevator doors opened on the hospital's main floor, and she walked directly into a wall of uniform. The colonel stood 12 feet away, flanked by 4 SEAL officers whose posture made it clear they weren't asking. Major Reyes. Not a question. A declaration. Elena's stride didn't falter. Her face didn't register surprise. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the feeling of a chain breaking after 6 years of tension. She took one measured breath and met the colonel's eyes with the same quiet dignity she'd offered Dr. Ashford in the parking lot. Colonel. Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid nurse was gone. The SEAL team commander stepped forward, a man whose call sign was probably Breaker or Halloway, someone whose hands had held lives and weapons with equal competence. Major, I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Command. We need to speak with you about Sangin. About what actually happened. And about what Dr. Ashford did. At that precise moment, 4 million people across the Houston metropolitan area were watching Dr. Ashford sit in the sterile comfort of a television studio, his tie adjusted to precisely the right angle of sincerity. The morning news anchor smiled her practice smile. Doctor, you've raised some concerns about a nurse who performed unauthorized procedures. Ashford leaned into the camera like a man settling into a story he'd rehearsed. It's a regrettable misunderstanding about proper protocols. Patient safety must always come first. When a staff member, regardless of good intentions, violates hospital policy, we have to act. I hope people understand that this wasn't a personal matter. It was about maintaining the integrity of our institution. The anchor nodded sympathetically. Professional. Measured. The kind of segment that would make Ashford's reputation bulletproof. A doctor protecting hospital standards. A leader making difficult calls. Then her earpiece crackled. The anchor's expression shifted. Confusion crossed her face like a cloud. She touched her earpiece, her eyes moving to the camera with genuine surprise. We have a caller. A Commander Morrison from Naval Special Warfare Command. Commander, you wanted to speak. Ashford's smile remained in place. His fingers relaxed on the desk. Of course. I'm happy to clarify any. Morrison's voice cut through the speakers like a scalpel through tissue. Calm. Precise. The voice of someone who had briefed generals. Dr. Ashford, I'm looking at casualty reports from Sangin in 2017. You were the medical officer who filed paperwork indicating Major Elena Reyes was killed in action. The smile froze. Ashford's jaw tightened by precisely 2 millimeters. You also filed reports stating that morphine supplies were destroyed in a fire during a combat engagement on May 14, 2017. 5,000 milligrams of morphine. Completely incinerated, according to your documentation. Ashford's face began to drain of color on split screen, the news studio showing his composure cracking like old paint, the official military feed showing Morrison in a secure briefing room, surrounded by 3 Silver Star medals mounted on the wall behind him. However, Morrison continued, we have testimony from 3 SEAL witnesses that observed you personally diverting those supplies. We have testimony that Major Reyes attempted to report your theft to her commanding officer. And we have testimony that you fabricated her death to prevent her from testifying before a formal investigation. The anchor's eyes had widened. She was watching Ashford's face in real time, watching the institutional armor crack. Familiar viewers were watching with her. Major Reyes survived her wounds despite your negligence, Morrison said, his voice never raising, never needing to. She was medically discharged before she could provide statements. Her career ended because you stole from wounded soldiers. We've been documenting this for 6 years. The Judge Advocate General will be contacting you within the hour, Dr. Ashford. You should probably call your attorney first. The news feed went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the anchor spoke, her voice thin, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. We'll be right back. But nobody switched the channel. Ashford sat alone in the media room as his phone began to ring. The hospital board. His lawyer. The FBI. The calls came in a cascade, and with each one, his carefully constructed narrative dissolved into something else entirely: felony theft of controlled substances, falsifying military records, obstruction of justice, endangering military personnel. Security escorted him from the building by 10:45 hours. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. The story he'd spent 6 years burying was now playing on repeat across Houston, across Texas, across the internet. He wasn't a medical administrator protecting hospital standards. He was a thief who'd stolen from wounded soldiers and fabricated a hero's death to cover it. 6 months later, Elena stood in Seattle General's newly dedicated Veterans Trauma Center, her white coat embroidered with Major Elena Martinez, Director, in military lettering. The program served former combat medics transitioning to civilian nursing, people whose hands had held lives in field hospitals and could now hold them in sterile operating rooms. People rebuilding after the kind of wounds nobody talks about at dinner. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, fully recovered, cut the ribbon alongside the hospital's CEO, who had apologized in writing 17 times. Jamie stood beside his father, his hand gripping his father's shoulder. The 3 of them didn't need to speak. The ceremony did the speaking for them. In her office, Elena kept that single dog tag, Marcus's, the one she'd pulled from the rubble in Sangin, mounted on a plaque that read, "Some chains break so others can be forged stronger." The broken chain hung beneath it, a reminder that second chances weren't theoretical. They were material. They were owned. Across Houston, Dr. Ashford sold supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall, his medical license permanently revoked, his trial scheduled for next month. His presence like a ghost that nobody acknowledged, a man who'd had everything and lost it to his own theft, his own calculation, his own inability to understand that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Elena passed him once, purely by accident, in a grocery store parking lot. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Ashford's face changed, recognition and something like shame. He started to speak. Elena took one measured breath, met his eyes with that same quiet dignity, and walked past without breaking stride. The silence between them lasted longer than any words could have. At the Veterans Trauma Center's first graduation, Elena gave a speech to 12 former combat medics now certified as civilian nurses. They stood in dress uniforms, their white coats hanging over their shoulders, ready to step into civilian medicine. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd survived what they'd survived. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. They might be holding pressure on a wound. They might be holding their breath during surgery. They might be holding a secret that could change everything. Don't judge by what you see. Judge by what survives. The 12 graduates stood and applauded, and Elena saw her own reflection in their eyes, survivors rebuilding, carrying what they'd seen into something that saved rather than haunted. Marcus Webb shook her hand afterward, his son beside him, both of them wearing the expression of men who'd been found. "Thank you, Major. For Sangin. For everything." Elena smiled, the expression finally reaching her eyes. Just doing my job, Lieutenant. Then and now. Outside, the Texas sun set over Houston in shades of amber and rust. Elena drove home with her windows down, the evening air warm and clean. No more ghosts chasing her. No more chains. Just a second chance that had been earned through 6 years of quiet composure and one perfect moment of justice. The dog tag hung from her rearview mirror, catching the sunset, a reminder that some chains break so others can be forged stronger. She didn't need anyone to tell her who she was anymore. She was Major Elena Martinez, Archangel, and the whole world knew it now. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.